This is an attempt at a reflection on learning from Sean Donnelly for module LI 501. Hopefully it's a successful attempt at reflecting, but I'm not too sure if it is. I'm doing this by Screencast because I thought articulating this out loud might help me craft my thoughts a bit more, and I've actually found this more difficult than actually putting pen to paper, but maybe that's something to reflect on another day. For this reflection, I'm going to use Gibbs' reflective cycle, and to position the goal of this cycle, I wanted to use a quote from Aldous Huxley, if that's okay. And the quote is, "But life is short and information endless. Nobody has time for everything. In practice, we are generally forced to choose between an unduly brief exposition and no exposition at all. Abbreviation is a necessary evil, and the abbreviator's business is to make the best of a job which, though intrinsically bad, is still better than nothing. He must learn to simplify, but not to the point of falsification. He must learn to concentrate upon the essentials of a situation, but without ignoring too many of reality's qualifying side issues. In this way, he may be able to tell, not indeed the whole truth, for the whole truth about almost any important subject is incompatible with brevity, but considerably more than the dangerous quarter-truths and half-truths which have always been the current coin of thought." That was written in 1958 in the essay A Brave New World Revisited, which was written 20 years after the novel A Brave New World. The original novel anticipated things like sleep learning and classical conditioning, which involves learning new behavior via the process of association. So, for example, if a student associates a negative emotional response when having to interact with peers online, this can have bad results, resulting in a lack of engagement. And that's kind of brought me on to this. So the goal of this reflection, or this reflection, was prompted by my own emotional response to some of the online discussions. So in the online discussions, which I quite enjoy, but sometimes actually if I'm quite busy in work, I might fall behind, and it's difficult to catch up because one needs to break down a block of time in order just to catch up on the discussions, never mind actually consuming the core module content. And that's fine, but also one of the things that people were doing in the discussions was they were sharing lots of new content which wasn't necessarily core module content. So in a way, I think those people were constructing their own knowledge, and they were demonstrating their willingness to share that knowledge, which is really good. But I think for me, as having fallen behind, I had an emotional response to that where I felt overwhelmed, as opposed to grateful for my peers for sharing that new knowledge. And I'm being flippant by sharing this, but this thought came to mind as I was going through some of those forum posts. And funnily enough, so I do my best to kind of consume the things that people are sharing, but I tend to end up in this situation where I just have lots of tabs open, and I might spend lots of time going through this stuff and not get to the core content, or I just open this stuff, I get stressed about it, but then I need to move on to something else. So kind of reflecting on that from like a good point of view, participants are actively constructing and sharing their own knowledge, and some participants are really enthusiastic about that, but from a negative point of view, perhaps there could be a cognitive overload. Again, just kind of going back to this slide, from people going through the stuff and feeling like they need to consume all of that content, that useful content that people are sharing. And then as well as that, we saw in a post yesterday, one of the students saying that actually she was afraid of just participating in the discussion if she didn't have time to read up lots of things beforehand, because she didn't want to demonstrate that her own domain knowledge was weaker than some of the other participants. So I kind of wondered then, okay, does that mean that some participants are oversharing, um, or not? So in thinking about reflection ideas, the first thing I did was I went back to the module descriptor, and the very first line says, the module has a student-centered approach to encouraging learners to share and learn from one another. So that's absolutely consistent with the discussion forums. But then I also, in reading Cisco's report, which is one of the things from the first learning object, there's a part in that about how the brain functions and how we think serially. So we can only have so many things in our short-term memory at once. So there's a delay from switching from one task to another. So I kind of thought, okay, I found as I was going through the forums, I was opening new pages as I was like clicking hyperlinks as people were sharing things, and then I was finding I was being distracted and I was getting away from what the actual discussion was about. So that delay was becoming more and more pronounced the more people were sharing articles and links, and that may have just been me. So in terms of thinking about things to reflect upon, I thought about, okay, when does a discussion forum stop being a discussion forum? And I thought, okay, based on that then, are there guidelines for managing discussions and learners, or are there rules around the optimal number of participants in an online forum, or how can we manage differences between learners who may have a really strong domain knowledge and learners with different levels of ICT skills? And I should probably just point out, so these are just kind of my own thoughts based on an emotional response that I had to a very good discussion forum. This is not about trying to find a better way of managing a discussion forum, because I've run discussion forums myself, and I'm aware of those challenges, and I haven't found a way to manage those things myself before. And I do remember running an online module to students who weren't based in DCU, and I remember one of them rang me one day and he said, this isn't nearly as good as doing it in the classroom. And I said, we don't have the opportunity to do this in a classroom, and neither did we have the opportunity to do it live, because in today's world people just wanted to consume the content at different times, so that just wasn't an option for us. So in thinking about Cisco's multimodal learning through media report, I was particularly drawn to page 8, where I just want to highlight this, where it said experienced teachers recognize that the design of lessons must adapt to the expertise and prior knowledge of the learner, the complexity of the content and interests of the learner. And I thought, okay, I wonder then, do we need to be mindful of, well, clearly we do need to be mindful of the expertise and prior knowledge of the learners, but what if there's quite a broad scale there in terms of expertise and prior knowledge? In terms of managing a forum or any e-learning object, do we need to craft that in order to suit those different kinds of people? So I got to then, okay, fact is we are all different, so there is no one size fits all. So I thought about, okay, what about so we've got utility, and then we've got user experience. So utility of discussion forum, absolutely, it's really useful, but then I started thinking about user experience, and that kind of led me on to thinking about the challenges of merging theories of usability design and evaluation with developments in e-learning, not just in discussion forums. And I kind of wondered to myself then, in our readings about digital literacy, does one need to be digitally literate in order to use e-learning? And so who should e-learning be designed for? And So coming from a marketing background, we would prepare content based on personas. So we would create personas of our target audience, and I thought, okay, do we need to think about our target audience in this case and create personas for those people? So are there different levels of e-learning and different kinds of discussions? So we break people out into things. So that kind of, okay, I examined some kind of the personality model. So clearly I was more on the neurotic sensitive side, that when I fell behind by a week, the thought of catching up on the discussion forums scared me. And then I was thinking about the Briggs-Myers scale of personality traits, and you've got extroversion and introversion, and certain extrovert people would be much more willing to not just participate in discussion forums, but also just try new things and be willing to, in using a digital interface, click different buttons and explore and so on, much more than an introvert. And clearly I have a spelling mistake there. So I was thinking to myself, okay, well, can we classify students and look at how digitally literate are they? So I kind of thought of a number of different kind of questions to ask there, and these are kind of based on usability from a product design and marketing point of view, but general device skills. So what can people do? Do they have knowledge of the software in use? So from an e-learning point of view, it's not just browsers, but also e-learning tools and learning management systems and so on. And then what domain knowledge do they have in the particular area? So kind of coming back to digital literacy there in terms of, okay, technical skills, but then the other kind of things as well, the cognitive skills and socio-emotional skills. So this reflection is about what is usable e-learning, and can some of the approaches to usability in marketing be used in approaches to measuring usability in education, and with particular reference to e-learning objects? And are there models for evaluation and design of e-learning? And even if there are there entry points for digital learners, and what skills do they need to be able to consume e-learning objects? And then finally, how can we manage differences between learners that have a strong domain knowledge versus learners that have differing levels of ICT skills? And I guess, like, a thing to note is, as we create not just e-learning objects, but I guess creating materials for any class or whatever, that people will use materials and consume materials and possibly understand materials in different ways, whether we like it or not. So are there ways that we can sort of manage best practice and so on? So in terms of it gives reflection cycle now, kind of moving on to analysis, although I may have already done that. So why is usability important? Well, I think it is from a marketing point of view, or I'm used to thinking about this from a marketing point of view, where it's a good customer experience depends on good usability, and equally a good learner experience depends on good usability. Financial implications are similar. So from a marketing point of view, we think of customer lifetime value, but from an e-learning point of view, if our e-learning materials aren't doing the job that they're meant to do, then we might need to pay to redesign those things, or just to manage those things. And equally, it will cost us in terms of just managing support or a help desk or answering to questions online and so on. So if our user can't use it, then it doesn't work. So that's a marketing point of view. But going beyond pure utility, and this is kind of where I start thinking about learners is while something may be very useful and it meets the needs, and from a usability point of view, we may be able to use it, but then there's also the experiential stuff, and where we can start thinking about motivation of learners and would they like to interact with the learning object, and are they satisfied using that, and so on. So in terms of methodologies for measuring usability, there are different things we can do. So there are heuristic evaluations where we compare our objects to guidelines, and then there are things that we can do, so surveys and focus groups, or just observe people, observe how they actually interact with the learning objects that we create, or observe people as they participate in forums, in online forums. So that would be an interesting thing to see. If somebody reads something, do they choose to write a response there and then, or as one student said, they'll take time to think about it and come back to it later on, or does somebody then, after having read somebody's post, are they triggered then to do their own independent research based on what they've just read before they respond? For heuristics, so this guy Jakob Nielsen, he's kind of seen as a usability guru, I suppose, and he wrote this book. It's over 20 years old now, called Designing Web Usability, and in it he listed 10 usability heuristics. These are based on 200 different kind of studies or whatever, and he distilled these things down to these 10 heuristics. So he's got visibility of system status, match between the system and the real world, user control and freedom, consistency and standards, and so on. I guess I don't need to read through them. But lots of usability professionals would use these heuristics to compare things against, so whether it's a new website or an e-commerce site or any kind of interface. So I kind of wonder, do people use this from an e-learning point of view? And it turns out they do. Instead of going through all 10, I decided to go through one or two just to see how well these could be mapped towards e-learning. So in the first one, visibility of system status. So we want to see a visual notification of what the system is doing in response to a user interaction. So we can actually see here, so in this learning object about reflective writing, we can see a number of different examples here. So we can see down here, so this tells us what slide we're on, and we can also see this, so our player function here, so we can see where we are in terms of the time elapsed here, or on the playhead, and then we can also see that this is showing up as being paused because it is paused. And then we can see the same thing over here, so we can see that we're on slide 13 of 15, which is reflective writing, and that is highlighted here. So that is one way where we can map one of Nielsen's heuristics towards an e-learning object. But a lot of Nielsen stuff was kind of a product design and web design, and not specifically for e-learning. So I decided to do some research on okay, what is usable e-learning. So this guy Don Norman says usability is not the major issue, learnability is, and that's interesting. So it comes back all the way back to, sorry for going backwards here, but our sort of utility versus desirability point of view, in terms of just because something is usable, it doesn't mean that it's useful. So while a 3-hour screencast might be usable, it doesn't mean that it's desirable or that students would like using it. Probably much the same as this screencast, but whatever. So one can quickly surmise that expecting users to manage numerous levels of interaction required to accomplish their learning tasks online is not a minor statement of faith. So when we think about Nielsen's 10 heuristic guidelines. He's kind of writing those about which can be mapped against a website. So um, a heuristic reviewer or an expert reviewer could take a look at a website and think about all of those heuristics and kind of say, yeah, I'm going to score these things here and say this website is good or it's bad and so on. From an e-learning point of view, where a student might actually be, if they're consuming a whole course online, they may be interacting via the learning management system, where they're interacting via a discussion forum. They're consuming learning objects, which may have been created in several different kinds of e-learning authoring tools. And they're also getting emails, and then as well they may be using other tools, so social media and so on, Twitter, Facebook, social bookmarking tools. So there's lots of different things there to manage in terms of their interaction, which I think significantly increases the complexity required or the complexity involved in consuming course material and getting through that course. So turns out so there are quite a few people who have done this work actually into usability heuristics for e-learning. So I have taken these guidelines actually from a paper called Usable E-Learning, a conceptual model for evaluation and design, and I have referenced it here. So there's kind of one thing I kind of wanted to highlight for myself. I kind of thought, okay, communications protocols. Our instructions provided for engaging with learners online, and our documents, resources, and task instructions shared across learners. So that one I guess isn't as important here, but the first one, our instructions provided for engaging with learners online. So I'm kind of skipping ahead to my own kind of action plan, but I think if I'm running an online discussion again, I will do my best to provide instructions in terms of clearly identifying the purpose of the online discussion, and ideally, and I haven't done this research, so I guess it's something for me to check. In practice, it would be great if an online discussion could just be an online discussion without students having to be externally motivated by getting marks for participating, but actually just intrinsically motivated purely because of their interest and the pleasure in participating. I guess there's probably a whole other amount of research to be done there to identify how that could be done. But so we've got lots of different kind of heuristics there, and they're broken down into learner background and knowledge. So this is kind of where we're classifying our users and so on. Social dynamics. So do learners have mutual goals, and are they expecting the same outcomes and so on. And interaction display, so how do they interact with the interface. So some of these things that they do map fairly closely to Nielsen's heuristics, but they are broken down into a bit more sort of granular sort of points. And then there's our instructor activities, so this is where we come in as instructors and so on, and their environment and tools. But for the purpose of this reflection, let's break it right down again to make things simple. So effective e-learning should be useful in terms of content, usable, but I think most importantly, desirable. So is it useful? So content, will learners know they're on the right track? So we could see in that reflection e-learning object that we looked at, there was a status bar to show how students were progressing through the material, so that's useful. Is the content tailored to fit the learner's real life situations or expectations of the module? Okay, that's always important. Um, does material acknowledge goal completion? So that's interesting, and I know that that's something that I've been thinking about recently, but haven't looked too much into. But I would like to is the idea of open badges, and I know that they've been mentioned a couple of times recently. But that would be an interesting tool to acknowledge goal completion, and then just navigability, because on some of the whereas with web design we're used to having a consistent navigation bar at the top of a screen, and it's just always there. With e-learning, there may be multiple different buttons around the e-learning object. So let's see actually if we can take a look at this. Um, so is it easy to navigate? So here, so we have this menu here on the side, and here we've got our play buttons and forward and back and so on here. But there have been instances where there are other buttons to click in this screen here as well. And it would be interesting to see or to know if students always click on all of those buttons, or do they skip ahead without realizing. And is it usable? Is material readable? Can people perform the tasks? Can learners find what they're looking for? And then most importantly, is it desirable? So does it, of course, attract and retain our students, and does it appeal to them? Does it appeal to their emotions? So I think the bad news is, in terms of thinking about all of those heuristics, there is no one best design for everybody, because it just doesn't exist. From my point of view, an action plan for me would be to continue to use discussion forums and allow students to learn from each other, but at the same time articulate the goals of the forums, and if I can, carry out other research to find out, are there other ways to motivate students to participate in a forum. Monitor social dynamics, and that might also mean, do I need to break my students up into groups depending on the subject? So in some subjects there may be people who have very specific domain knowledge that they can bring to the module, which may intimidate other people who don't have that domain knowledge and they're purely learning. So do I need to break those kinds of people up? And then finally, in this course I plan or expect to build my own e-learning object, or at least plan my own e-learning object out. But I will use heuristics for that, in order to always think about the end user and think about those heuristic guidelines, and make sure that my e-learning object maps to those things, so that it is usable, useful, and hopefully fun for the student to participate in. So that might mean, I may also need to classify my users as well. So just coming back to kind of discussions on digital literacy, what kind of computer skills do people have, application knowledge, and then finally domain knowledge. So that's how I might break those people down. So that's the end of my webinar, or my screencast, and thanks very much.